Chapter 57, entitled Modern America, Still, meaning the name of the composer, and Musical Modernism in the United States. American composers of the early 20th century sought to define a unique tradition of American modernism. And perhaps this is certainly connected to the Harlem Renaissance, which was a cultural movement in the 1920s and 30s that highlighted African American contributions to the country's cultural heritage. And then we'll kind of explain what that is. And we're going to listen to a piece of music which is really cool by African American composer William Grant Still, who broke numerous racial barriers in the art music tradition. His suite for violin and piano looks to three Black visual artists for inspiration. So he uses these visual arts as inspiration to write music. The Harlem Renaissance. Okay, well, where is Harlem? Here is Manhattan Island, which is not very big, but millions of people live here, and this is where some of the tallest buildings in the United States are, and the island is on bedrock, so it's possible to build tall buildings. And then over here is the Hudson River and the Statue of Liberty, and the New York Harbor is over here, and then this is the East River, which goes this way, which is really not a river at all. It's just a part of the Hudson that goes around. Although there's a river called the Bronx River, which flows into the East River. So Harlem is way up here north. Each of these sections are kind of, this is Lincoln Square, where the Lincoln Center is, right? And this is the arts and Midtown, where we have the Broadway musicals and those kind of things. Anyway, over here is Harlem, which it has changed since the 1920s and 1930s, when it was all a Black neighborhood and hundreds of thousands of people lived there, and middle class, rich people, poor people, barber shops, tire stores, car dealerships, dentists, attorneys, music publishing companies, piano sales, you name it, it was there. So the 1920s and 1930s movement, called the Harlem Renaissance, celebrating African American culture, right, sparked by this book called The New Negro. And it was, at the time, they didn't call it the Harlem Renaissance, it was called the New Negro Movement, right? Encourage fellow Black artists for inspiration, call for racial equality. Again, this is when segregation was the law of the land. And for African Americans to have pride in their contributions, and to look around and say, gosh, we have really done a lot, and we are a major part of America. We should be proud of it. For their contributions to blues, jazz, spirituals, right? Anyway, here, regarding the Harlem Renaissance, characterizing the Harlem Renaissance was an overt racial pride that came to be represented in the idea of the new Negro, who through intellect and production of literature, art, and music could challenge the pervading racism and stereotypes to promote progressive and socialist politics and racial and social integration. The creation of art and literature would serve to uplift the race, a new Black identity. There are many examples of this Harlem Renaissance and this new Negro attitude and style. And some people objected to it. White people, even some Black people objected to it. It's like, what do these young people want to do? But here, this is curious, and you can relate to this. It says men, black men, wore loose suits that led to the later style known as the zoot, right? We've heard of zoot suits, which consisted of a wide-legged, high-waisted peg-top trousers and long coat with padded shoulders and wide lapels. Men also wore wide-brimmed hats, colored socks, white gloves, and velvet-colored Chesterfield coats. During this period, African Americans expressed respect for their heritage through a fad for leopard skin coats, indicating the power of the African animal. And then people like Josephine Baker, if you look into her contributions, she was pretty amazing talent and was a fan dancer and danced the nude, but not in America. She went to France and made her career, and she did movies and silent movies that are just phenomenal. And not because of the nudity, but because of her creativity. And she just danced in a free form that was pretty wildly creative. And then we mentioned Duke Ellington before. He was part of this Harlem Renaissance. Many, many other black artists in not just movies or music, but painters and sculptors, etc., were part of this movement. So here we're going to talk about William Grant Still, 1895, 1978. Was a composer and a violinist and involved with the Harlem Renaissance, Memphis, New York, arranger for radio and musical theater. He was a wildly great musician. He wrote a piece called Afro-American Symphony from 1931, and it was the first symphony by an African American composer performed by a major American orchestra. And his work called Troubled Island from 1949 was performed in a major opera house. And he had awards and fellowships and degrees, and he wrote the music for Gunsmoke, which when I was a kid was, it's like I didn't want to miss it. It was like on once a week, and it was just a Western, and very, very popular movie, TV series, TV show. And Perry Mason, also the attorney, right? And still probably being shown on some cable channels. So William Grant Still had all these accomplishments, including writing movie music and music for TV series. And when we sample his music, you'll hear these elements of spirituals, blues, and jazz in his music. He wrote 4 symphonies, orchestral suites, film scores, stage works, operas, chamber music, vocal music, piano music, choral music. Pretty good stuff. Okay, this is African-American poet Langston Hughes, was also part of the Harlem Renaissance. Here is William Grant Still. And we're going to sample his music, or one movement of his piece of music called Suite for Violin and Piano. It says, drawn on established genre, we would call it neoclassical, because form is really the element of it, and the shape is not so much crazy as it is just good, solid music. It has 3 movements, and each of the movements is inspired by a work of art by another African American. The first one is inspired by a piece called African Dancer, which is a sculpture, and I'm going to show you right away here. Third one, Mother and Child, and the second one, Mother and Child. Third one called Gaiman. So here is the first sculpture, the sculpture that inspired the first movement. Focused on depicting African Americans at work in the fields and as ceremonial participants. movements. This one is called African Dancer. This is a chalk on paper work of art called Mother and Child by another African American. So the second movement is inspired by this. And the third movement, which is one we're going to sample, is called Gaiman. And this is a sculpture. He was also involved with the Harlem Renaissance. So rhythmically and humorously, we could say that the music has these bluesy melodies, modal harmonies, examples of the Harlem stride piano, where you just do the bass note and the chord on the left hand, which is evolved from ragtime. Call and response figures, glissandos, trills, double stops. Again, it has three movements: African Dancer, Mother and Child, and Gaiman. And here is the third movement by William Grant Still from his suite for violin and piano. Notice the inclusion and elements of jazz and blues. Really neat piece of music. African American music performed by Asians, right? But that's the way music is. Okay, I just want to play a little bit from the theme from Gunsmoke, written by William Grant Still. that will conclude our chapter 57 on William Grant Still and a little discussion of the Harlem Renaissance.